Good morning and welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.net. Thanks for tuning in this morning. Before I begin and continue our reading and discussion of the book, The Papacy and the Civil Power, I want to explain to my listeners, because of my liberal comments yesterday on the subject that we were reading about, on reflection, I've decided that it might have been difficult, because of my many comments, it might have been difficult for some of my listeners to follow the thought processes of the author of this book, R.W. Thompson. Now, I don't apologize for my commentary, but out of courtesy for my listeners, since it is R.W. Thompson, since R.W. Thompson's book is the subject of our discussion, I don't want what he says to be lost within my comments. So, in fairness to my listeners and to R.W. Thompson, I wish to begin at the beginning of this chapter, chapter 20, on page 615. We're only backing up a few pages, and it won't take long to cover. I just want my listeners to hear now what R.W. Thompson said on the broadcast yesterday without my commentary. Beginning, as I said, page 615 at the beginning of the chapter, chapter 20, talking about the infallibility of the Pope. Now, R.W. Thompson says, it ought not to be considered as asking too much of those who support the absolutism of the papacy when we insist that they shall address themselves to our consciences in furnishing a solution of the problem involved in the claim of the Pope's infallibility. It concerns the present age of the world too much to let it rest upon mere assertion that because it has been dogmatically avowed by a number of popes, therefore it is true. Such persons as have been trained in the school of submission and accept whatsoever is told them by their superiors may be satisfied with this. But to those who recognize no obligation of this nature, something more is due if they are expected to acquiesce in it. Quote, "No man," said Archbishop Tillotson, "can be under an obligation to believe anything who hath not sufficient means whereby he may be assured that such a thing is true." Unquote. Yet when the objection is urged that this dogma places the papacy in direct antagonism to the domestic policy of the progressive nations, we are told, as if it were a complete answer, that there's nothing new in this, that it is a part of the ancient faith descended from Peter and which has known no variation from the beginning. Thus the whole question is rested, and we are required to give our assent or remain under the pontifical curse if we do not. It has been elsewhere asserted that before the late council of, it has been asserted elsewhere that before the late council, the infallibility of the church was generally recognized by its lay members, especially in the United States, as lodged in the whole body of the church, acting according to the unvarying custom through general councils and the popes conjointly. Even if the hierarchy thought otherwise, they studiously avoided any open declaration to that effect, leaving those to whom it was their duty to teach the whole truth in ignorance and delusion. There were even some of them who were not guilty of this unpardonable sin of omission, but actually misled their flocks into the acceptance of a fatal error. And others who did not go so far silently acquiesced in the imposture. About 20 years ago, there was published and extensively circulated in the United States a work devoted to the discussion of the question of church authority. the precise question involved in the dogma of papal infallibility. It was written by a former clergyman of the English Church who had gone over to the Roman Church as an explanation of his reasons for doing so. Starting out by defining the word ecclesia to mean any combination of men, he insists that in that sense the church was established by Christ with the office of deciding what is human and what divine, and of interpreting the system of which it is the depository. He then proceeds to instruct us what the church is, where it is that the Holy Ghost is always present, and where this power of interpretation is lodged. He proves by Irenaeus, Origen, and other fathers that, quote, the divine spirit, unquote, which directs the church, quote, has its dwelling in the collective body, which is our sole guide in the things of God, unquote. He defines, quote, the collective episcopate to be the medium of church authority, and insists that Christ provided for the church as the law of its organization that the same persons, that is, the bishops, who were individually the dispensers of grace, should collectively be witnesses to doctrine, unquote. And then, in flat denial of papal infallibility, if not the primacy of Peter, he declares that this principle of church organization, quote, proceeds on the supposition that the gift bestowed upon the apostles, and which had been inherited by their successors, had been given to them as a body, not to bishops, and that no bishop or bishops could possess it apart from the communion of the whole. That as grace and truth lay in Christ our Lord, and afterward in the college of the apostles, so it had been inherited by the whole episcopate as a trust, in which they had a common share, unquote. That this principle has received the approbation of all the ages since Christ, he considers, quote, manifest from the weight attached to the general councils, unquote. He quotes this language from Cyprian, quote, the episcopate is a single trust administered collectively by many individuals, unquote. And this from the Apostolic Constitutions, quote, for the confirmation of you who are put in trust with the universal episcopate, unquote. This episcopate he calls by the equivalent names of the quote-unquote one church of Christ, the federal union, and the sacerdotal college. And then summing up, he says, quote, these principles evidently imply that the interpretation of doctrine was lodged as a perpetual trust in the episcopate, but the exercise of this function implied the cooperation of all bishops as a collective whole, unquote. Now, it would be hard to find language more directly condemnatory of the doctrine of papal infallibility than this. Not only does it show that no such doctrine prevailed in the early ages of the church, but that it is an express conflict with, quote, the law of its organization, unquote, as ordained by Christ. The writer was highly complimented for the manner in which he performed his task and for the learning he displayed. He was considered as a valuable acquisition to the church, and doubtless one object in circulating his book was to influence hesitating Protestants, if they could be found, by his argument. Another object, undoubtedly, was to disprove what many Protestants considered the tendency toward papal infallibility in the church, and still another, to quiet any apprehension that might exist among the laymen of the church in regard to the threatened concentration of all the power of the church in the hands of the Pope. It may be readily called to mind by almost anybody how flatly and even spitefully it was denied that any such concentration was designed, as it may now be realized how this denial served to mislead many who find themselves deluded. This book was only one of many instrumentalities employed to carry on this work. Having performed its task, it is now consigned to obscure places where the dust and cobwebs may settle on it, while the faithful are instructed that the very doctrine it denied and condemned has always been the doctrine of the church. Another book was published a few years ago, written by a priest, designed to show that, quote, the father of lies, unquote, had circulated misrepresentations and calumnies against the church in his country. In reference to, quote, new additions, unquote, to the faith, he says, it would be, quote, unquote, damnable to believe otherwise than as Christ teaches, although it, quote, should be denied and commanded to be believed by 10,000 councils, unquote. And I'll just simply add, the message is clear. This Roman Catholic priest says, our teacher is Christ, not popes and not councils. His direct inference is that neither the popes nor the councils are infallible. Only Christ is infallible, and to that I agree. Now, continuing, it says, and answering the accusation that the pastors and prelates are held to be infallible, he classes it along with other, quote, misrepresentations, unquote, of which, quote, the father of lies, unquote, is the author, and says, quote, the papist, truly represented, believes that the pastors and prelates of his church are fallible, that there is none of them but what may fall into error and heresies, and consequently liable to be deceived, unquote. And he assigns infallibility only, quote, to the whole church, unquote. Now, just to make sure the meaning is clear, he has already said popes and councils are fallible. And he says the only infallibility lies in the whole church. What's he saying? That the popes and the councils, together with the lay people, constitute the whole church, and that only then can infallibility be believed. I disagree. I think he started out on better footing in the beginning when he suggested that only Christ is infallible. And I think anybody of reason who has not been polluted by Roman Catholicism would have to agree. Now, continue with the text. It says, coming at last to the Pope, he says that it is an exhibition of the black art which the devil practiced in paradise, to charge the papist with believing that he has taken the place of Christ, and that whatsoever he orders, decrees, and commands is to be received by his flock with the same respect, submission, and awe as if Christ had spoken it by his own mouth. Or that he is, quote, no longer liable to error, but is infallible, unquote. He indignantly repels the insulting and impious falsehood as the devil's work, and declares that the Pope is the head of the church only as, quote, every father of a family owns himself to be the master of it under Christ, unquote, and that while God assists the popes in the administration of their office, no man is, quote, obliged to believe them infallible, unquote, because no such doctrine has ever been defined by the church. There was yet another book of this same kind published with the official endorsement of Bishop Fitzpatrick of Boston, who certainly was fully instructed in the doctrines of his church. The author of this book meets the question of papal infallibility squarely, and disposes of it without equivocation, manifestly intending to put it at rest, so that his adversary should have no excuse of again referring to it. That there may be no misconception of his meaning, the whole of what he said is given as follows. Quote, I shall therefore tell the gentleman once and for all, and in the clearest terms I am able to express myself, that when you speak of the Roman Catholic Church and maintain it to be that infallible church which Christ has established upon the earth, and to which all his promises of perpetual assistance were made, we mean not the particular church or the Diocese of Rome, which as a diocese has its jurisdiction limited and is no more the universal church than the Diocese of Paris or Toledo, because a part is not the whole. But we mean the whole body of Roman Catholics, whatsoever country or diocese they belong to, professing the same faith and living in communion with the Bishop of Rome, whom they acknowledge to be their supreme pastor or head of the church on earth. This is plain English, and if the gentleman will not understand it, but persists in his real or pretended ignorance, and to impose upon his readers with a manifest equivocation, I can say no more to render him sensible of his mistake. I observe, fourthly, that the gentleman has sometimes a great itching to shift the state of the question from the infallibility of the Church to that of the Pope. Nay, he tells his lordship in plain terms, quote, that not to place the infallibility in the Pope is given up our whole foundation, unquote. I am sorry he understands the doctrine of the Church no better, which he ought to have done before he wrote against it. For as a controvertist, he ought only to dispute against the articles of our faith fairly stated, and not against private opinions. Now, the infallibility of the Pope is one of these. Some Catholic divines write for it, and many against it, without any breach of communion with the See of Rome. And therefore the gentleman shall have the liberty of talking by himself upon that subject as much as he pleases, for I am not bound to answer anything wherein the articles of faith which I pretend to maintain is not concerned, unquote. Language more expressive could scarcely have been found. It'll be observed that he not only lodges infallibility in the whole body of the Church, but denies flatly the doctrine of papal infallibility. Some divines, he says, favor it, but many oppose it, clearly signifying that the latter constitute the majority. When it is considered that all this was especially approved by a distinguished prelate of the Roman Catholic Church, it may be regarded as a sufficient set-off against the contrary assertions now so frequently and dogmatically made. But there is abundant evidence equally conclusive and satisfactory to show that this question was met and dealt with in Europe in the same way, from the very earliest efforts of the Jesuits to keep the popes on their side by its persistent and pertinacious advocacy. Now, remember, it was the Jesuits who foisted this papal infallibility to be a construct of the First Vatican Council of 1870. The very purpose for the calling of that council was to declare the Pope infallible. It was the Jesuits who were behind that. They were simply consolidating all the power of the Church into one man to make the Church easier to control by the Jesuits. The Jesuits, prior to the declaration of papal infallibility, had to manage all the voices in the Church. But now, after papal infallibility was declared, they only had to control the Pope to set the course for the Church in the world. Now remember, the purpose of the Church, the purpose of the Roman Catholic Church, is to become the single sovereign governing entity in the world under the New World Order. And it is the purpose of the Jesuits to see that that happens. And the Jesuits simply made it easier to accomplish by putting all the authority of the church into the Pope, by declaring him infallible. Now, my assertion is that they went way too far, that the world is not willing to admit as a general rule that the Pope is infallible, even including Roman Catholics. And history has recorded that this has been a divisive and controversial subject in the Roman Catholic Church since the very beginning. This is what R.W. Thompson is laying out for us. He said there is abundant evidence, equally conclusive and satisfactory, to show that this question was met and dealt with in Europe in the same way from the very earliest efforts of the Jesuits to keep the popes on their side by its persistent and pertinacious advocacy. In other words, they won control of the papacy by flattering them with the idea that they are infallible, and they kept the popes on the side of the Jesuits. You see how clever they are? He says a thesis was published in Paris in the 17th century wherein it was claimed that Christ had communicated his own infallibility to the Pope, but in questions, both in questions of right and of fact. This thesis was immediately laid before all the bishops of France, it being well understood that it came from the College of the Jesuits. Another soon after appeared from the same source, not merely affirming what the first contained, but insisting that the system of Copernicus, as defended by Galileo, should be considered as battered down, because, quote, the Vatican has also thundered against it, and the sentences delivered by the Congregation of the Cardinals of the Inquisition has overthrown by its just censure the hypothesis, or rather the thesis of Copernicus in the person of Galileo, unquote. The avowed purpose was to carry the doctrine of the Pope's infallibility to the extent of requiring, quote, some mathematicians, more bold than religious, unquote, who accepted the Copernican theory and the teachings of Galileo, to submit to the authority of this censure. In other words, to acknowledge the Pope's infallibility and his judgments. This thesis was submitted to the learned faculty of the Divine of Paris. The Parliament of Paris also took the matter into consideration. It was thus brought directly before the whole country, and presented in such form as to invoke all the best intellects of France in its consideration. The result was a strong and decidedly affirmance of the doctrine set forth in the ancient decrees of the faculty of divinity, which were embodied in 6 distinct propositions. These are important. Listen to these. Number 1, it is denied that the Pope has any indirect power or authority over the temporalities of the king. Number 2, that the king has no other superior in temporals than God alone. Number 3, that subjects owe such allegiance to the king that it cannot be dispensed with upon any pretense whatsoever. Number 4, that the Pope cannot depose bishops against the rules of the canons. And we'll continue with reading and commentary when we get back from the break. You're listening to Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio.
Years ahead of the dominant media, FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net. The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on Internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
The book of Revelation says, the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ. This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy Reality News app. Get it now.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update, which I remind the listeners is brought to you by FirstAmendmentRadio.com. So if you like Inquisition Update and the information we present here, please support Inquisition Update by supporting First Amendment Radio. Now, the blasphemous proposition of papal infallibility got its first test not in a Protestant nation, but a Roman Catholic nation, France. It was brought, the question of papal infallibility was brought to the elite colleges, theological colleges of France. It was brought before the whole nation. And the entire nation of France, which is Catholic, made decisions about this so-called dogma of papal infallibility. And it decided, number one, it is denied that the Pope has any indirect power or authority over the temporalities of the king. In other words, the Pope has no power, no indirect power over the kings of the nations. Even in Roman Catholic countries, remember this is France. And it says, number two, the king has no other superior in temporals than God alone. In other words, no king on earth has to answer to the Pope. Not even a Roman Catholic king, as is in France. It says that subjects owe such allegiance to the king that it cannot be dispensed with upon any pretense whatsoever. Which means that the people swear allegiance to the king, not the Pope. And that can't be set aside by anyone. That from a Roman Catholic country, not a Protestant one. Now it says, number four, that the Pope cannot depose bishops against the rules of the canons. In other words, the popes can't dispense with the rules of the church, okay, the Church of France, and the canon laws of the church. Remember, we cited earlier that one pope claimed that his divine right to even dispense with the laws of the church. And he can dispense with the words of God. This is clearly blasphemy by anybody's standards. And France, the Roman Catholic nation of France, determined that the Pope cannot depose bishops against the rules of the canons. In other words, he has to abide by the church's laws, where the popes insist that they're not bound by any law, divine or otherwise. Number 5, that the Pope is not above general council, which means the authority of the church is vested in the councils, not the popes. So how can they be infallible? How can the popes claim infallibility when they can be overruled by a council? And number 6, that the Pope is not infallible when he has not the concurrent consent of the church. Now, the opinion of these leading minds of France, so clearly and strongly expressed, shows beyond all controversy what was the opinion of the Gallican Christians, the Gallican Catholics, on this subject. Now, these Gallicans were the Catholics of France. And remember, what distinguishes the Gallicans is that they objected to the dogma of papal infallibility, and they rebelled against the papacy, and they told the papacy in no uncertain terms, you may remain the spiritual head of the church, but you butt out of French politics. You stay out of our civil affairs. And they were ready to go to war against their church, against the bishops. They were sick and tired of the Jesuits meddling in political affairs and trying to, remember the Gallican Christians, or the Gallican Catholics rather, the French Catholics, were living at peace with the Protestants. And the Jesuits in France were constantly trying to pronounce the Protestants of France to be heretics, and to get either the king or the parliament to extirpate the Protestants out of France, to exterminate them, just as they had done the Waldenses and the Albigensians and the Hussites and all of those who would not bend the knee to the Pope. And these Gallican Catholics, these French Catholics, wanted no part of it. All right, so they put the Pope and the Jesuits in their place when they rejected papal infallibility. Remember, papal infallibility was the aim of the Jesuits. They flattered the popes into acquiescing to this papal decree at the First Vatican Council, and they divided the church. And leading that division were these Gallican Catholics of France. Now, it says the Jesuits were not able to drive them from their position, and therefore, when Bossuet, the great bishop of Meaux, who stood at their head, undertook to define the relation between sovereigns and the popes, he said, quote, that kings and princes are not subject in the temporal order to any ecclesiastical power by order of God, that they cannot be deposed either directly or indirectly by virtue of the keys of the church. Finally, that by virtue of that power, their subjects cannot be absolved from their fidelity, obedience, and oath of allegiance, which binds them to their prince. Unquote. Pretty powerful words coming from Roman Catholics in a Roman Catholic nation against the assertions of the Jesuits and the so-called infallible popes of Rome, right? So this question has been decided thoroughly by Roman Catholics, not by Protestants. No assertion can be made that France made their decision based on the protests of Protestants. These were Catholics leading the assault against the pretended impostures of the papacy and the Jesuits. Now it says the oath of supremacy and allegiance, which the English law during the reign of James I required Roman Catholics to take, made it necessary they should swear that in their opinion the Pope had no power to depose the king, or to dispose of his kingdom, or to authorize its invasion, or, in other words, he couldn't call it a crusade. He couldn't legally call the Spanish Armada or the gunpowder plot. The Pope had no power to depose of kings or to deprive them of their kingdom. He could not authorize an invasion of that country or to discharge the citizens from their allegiance to the king. With them, it became a question whether, in the view of their obligations to the Pope, they could lawfully take this oath. They were not left in doubt long insofar as the Pope Paul V, was concerned, for he addressed to them a brief which condemned, quote, the oath as unlawful and containing many things manifestly contrary to faith and to salvation, unquote. Now what this means is that the Pope answered these quote-unquote rebellious Catholics in England that denial of the Pope's supreme authority over the government of England was a salvific issue, that they could burn in hell if they didn't uphold the Pope's power over the king. You see how the papacy uses it wraps its political power in a cloak of religion and arrogates to itself the power to damn people to hell that don't agree with it. That is the power that still rules in the Vatican. That the Pope claims the power to be able to damn one to hell that doesn't agree with the Pope. It's very important that the Roman Catholic Church has never forsworn this. They have never repudiated this. They've never departed from it. Not one iota. Now, he addressed them also a second brief of the same tenor. And Innocent X, after the death of Paul, condemned the oath anew. So we have two popes in succession who have condemned an oath as a violation of the Pope's power and with a threat attached to it of eternal damnation. Now it says, in this perplexed condition arising out of their divided loyalty, they consulted the faculty of divinity in Paris whether they could, in their opinion, take the oath without prejudice to the faith. And this after two infallible popes had declared solemnly and officially ex cathedra that they could not. So what they were doing were bringing into question the infallibility of the Pope. They were determined to resist this belief that the Pope was infallible and that they should obey him over the king. So again, the dogma of papal infallibility is being tested as if by fire. And it says, the 60 doctors of the faculty declared against these popes that they could take the oath without prejudice to the faith. And they did take it. The Jesuits, of course, were not satisfied at this direct and powerful opposition to their favorite theory of the Pope's infallibility, and they had no difficulty in having this opinion of the French doctors placed upon the Index at Rome, that is, the Index Expurgatorius, or the Index of Forbidden Books in Rome, so as to stamp it with pontifical condemnation and censure. So neither the Jesuits or the Pope are going to listen to the people. They're going to have their way. The Pope's infallible, you've got to do what he says. Even the king. And if the king disobeys the Pope, then the Pope can relieve the people of any allegiance to the king, and he can order him to overthrow the king, and the Pope can set a new king. Remember, the Pope says he's King of Kings and Lord of Lords. That's what the Jesuits say, that the Pope is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Okay, there's only one conclusion that anybody who reads a Bible and understands it can come to, and that is that the Pope is the biblical and historical and prophetic Antichrist. He's fulfilling his role as Antichrist in the world. He's exalted his throne above the stars of God. He asserts that he is God on earth, and that men and kings must believe him and obey him unquestioningly, as he is infallible and divine. It's got to make sense. This is the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. And we don't need to look in the future for an Antichrist. We've had one all along. We've had the Antichrist all along. Now, the same question arose afterward in England at a period nearer our own times, when toward the close of the last century, the question of Catholic emancipation, remember, Catholics were forbidden to practice Catholicism. The Jesuits were kicked out, and there came a time in English history when the sentiments arose that, well, maybe we should, give some liberty to these Catholics. After all, they are human beings. So, when the question of Catholic emancipation came up, and it was pending before the British Parliament, it was doubted by many whether it would be safe to confer full political privileges upon Roman Catholics because of the doctrines of the Papacy in regard to their allegiance. In other words, who are they going to serve? If we put them in government, if we give them a powerful role in the government and the affairs of this nation, to whom are they going to be loyal? Are they going to be loyal to the government that they serve? Or are they going to be loyal to the Pope and the government that he arrogates to overthrow our government? You see, this very question should be asked right here in America. To whom are the Catholics in government loyal? Are they loyal to the Constitution of the United States? Or are they loyal to the Pope and Roman Catholic canon law? Now, if we are too fearful to walk up to Nancy Pelosi and ask her, who do you serve? Fearing a charge of anti-Roman Catholic bigotry, well, we simply should examine her legislation to find out if it's consistent with the Constitution of the United States or if it's consistent with canon law. Certainly, there ought to be someone in Washington, D.C. that would take that issue upon themselves and examine thoroughly every politician in Washington, D.C., his voting record, to determine to whom they are loyal, and not be deceived by what they say, but examine what they do. What laws have they passed? What laws have they brought into legislation? And compare those laws in their conformity to the Constitution of the United States or their conformity to Roman Catholic canon law, and you'll have your answer. Now, England was legitimately, justifiably, and very seriously concerned when the question of granting emancipation, freedom to Roman Catholics to participate in the civil affairs of the nation, to ask the question, if we do, who are they going to serve? Are they going to serve the best interests of this country? Are they going to be loyal to our king and to our parliament? Or are they going to do as Catholics have always done? Succumb to the threats, the bulls and anathemas and excommunications and damnations of their popes if they don't rise up against the government and make the country Catholic. Listen, history has repeated itself so many, many times that it seems incomprehensible that we have not dealt with this question in this country in a formal manner. Certainly, this was the concern of R.W. Thompson at the writing of this book. Why is it of no concern today? Why is no politician ever charged with fashioning his legislation in conformity to Roman Catholic canon law? Why is no Jesuit priest ever called before the mainstream media and asked, who do you serve, the Pope or the government? We know you're not just a religious organization. You're first and foremost a political organization. That's why you're so prolific here in Washington, D.C., in the power centers of this country, shaping the opinions of the people. That's why you own so much of the press, to shape the opinions of the people. That's why you've infiltrated all the churches, to shape the opinions and beliefs of the people. You're a politician, first and foremost, and you wrap your political endeavors in religious garb to make it untouchable. But there's no law in this country that says I can't question you and your church, and I want to know, to whom are you loyal? And then realizing that no Jesuit is required by canon law to answer truthfully any question put before him that might jeopardize the church. So we're back to this. Examine history, and you will find that the Jesuits and Roman Catholics are first and foremost loyal to their Pope and to Roman Catholic canon law, and that they have no legitimate place in government. No legitimate place in any office of civil government, from the city dog catcher to the presidency of the United States. They have no legitimate place in the governing of any government. The United States should have done long ago what England tried to do. As long as they live in peace within the country, they live in peace. But the minute they start meddling in the affairs of state, they're out. You know, the world needs to come to the conclusion that if they want to be Roman Catholic and they want to worship this man in Rome, they ought to go to Rome. We ought to just cordon off Italy and reserve it for Roman Catholics all over the world. And let them fight out their own religion on their own, instead of trying to lead us all to the pit. Strong words? The times demand strong words and strong actions. Because if we fail to meet this papal opposition and attempt to overthrow our government, the whole world is going down with it. You know, Europe views the United States as the last best hope for liberty. And Europe sees the United States failing. I just wish Europe had the confidence and the faith and the fortitude to scream at the American people, the Pope is doing to the United States the same thing he did to all of Europe. Look at your history. Let us teach you the history of the popes. Scream at us with the same volume with which R.W. Thompson is screaming at the Americans at this time when he wrote this book. The gravest threat to the United States of America is the same grave threat that existed in all of Europe. That was the papacy and the Roman Catholic Church and his control of the kings and the governments of the world. Get out your Bible, polish off chapter 17 and 18 of the book of Revelation, and see it for yourself. And if you doubt this, and if you waver on this subject one whit, they will devour you from within, just like they devoured all of Europe. R.W. Thompson's absolutely correct in this book. He said the same questions arose afterward in England at a period nearer our own times, when toward the close of the last century the question of Catholic emancipation was pending before the British Parliament. It was doubted by many whether it would be safe to confer full political privileges upon Roman Catholics because of the doctrines of the papacy in regard to their allegiance. Strong efforts were made to remove this doubt, and as the most efficient means of doing so, the opinions of learned divines and foreign universities were solicited directly upon the question of the power of the Pope to depose monarchs and to release their subjects from allegiance, and the obligation of papists to keep faith with heretics. 3 questions embracing these points were sent to the universities of Louvain, Douai, and Paris in France, and Alcalá, Valladolid, and Salamanca in Spain. The answers were all condemnatory. They were all condemnatory of the doctrine of papal infallibility. In that from Douai, taken as a specimen, it is said, quote, that no power whatsoever in civil or temporal concerns was given by the Almighty, capital A, either to the Pope, the cardinals, or the Church herself, and consequently that kings and sovereigns are not, in temporal concerns, subject by the ordination of God to any ecclesiastical power whatsoever. Neither can their subjects, by any authority granted to the Pope or the Church from above, be freed from their allegiance or absolved from their oath of allegiance. Unquote. All the Roman Catholic universities in these Roman Catholic countries declared that the Pope was not infallible and that he could not usurp the kingdoms of kings and relieve Catholics of their oath of allegiance. Something to think about, and we'll talk about it more tomorrow on Inquisition Update.
Visit crosstheborder.org, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie, with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.